All right, folks are still rolling in. Thanks for coming. This is Matthew Clem with the City Planning Department. We're going to hold on just another minute or two before we get started until all some folks are still rolling. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. We've got a lot of city staff and some of our consultants here on tonight. Start with just a round of introductions of our team. I'm Matthew Clem in City Planning. I'll hand it over to Hannah Reckow on the team, and Hannah, just call out another team member as we open up here if you can.
Sure. So I'm Hannah Reckow. I'm planner with Planning and Development. Pass it off to JP.
Hi, everybody. I'm JP Mansolf with Planning and Development on the project team as well, and I'll pass it to Christian.
Hey everybody, my name is Christian Burns. I'm working with Planning and Development as well, along with JP, Hannah, Matt, and I will pass it off to Sarah.
Oh, hey everyone. It's so nice to see y'all tonight. I appreciate y'all coming out and spending some Zoom time with us. I'm Sarah Ellis. I'm the project manager and I'm a planner in the planning department, and just happy to see y'all. Thanks for being here.
And we'll hear from Dina. Go ahead, Dina.
Hi, I'm Dina Roadside. I'm with the firm of Roadside and Harwell, RHI, and I'm a planner. We're leading the consultant team working with the city on this project. Security.
Hi, everybody. Great to see you all. My name is Sukriti Ghosh. I'm an urban designer and working with the team for this project. And I'm going to hand it over to Russ. Russ, you are muted.
I'm Russell Archambault with RKG Associates. Thank you for coming out tonight. And I'll hand it to Jeff.
All right. Thanks, Russ. I'm Jeffrey Farrell with Jeffrey Farrell Associates, working with and for Dina and RHI. Good to see you all.
What about Deidre?
Hi everyone, I'm Deirdre Scanlon. I work for Public Participation Partners, and we're the public engagement consulting firm on this project. Also here tonight is my colleague Katie Maynard and Shauna Perry. Was there anybody else that we needed to introduce?
Yeah, we haven't heard from Latoya yet.
Okay.
Hi everyone, I'm Latoya Thomas with Brick and Story. I'm also part of the consulting team and pleased to be with you this evening.
All right, great. I think that's all of us. DJ, can we get the slides up and we'll kick off that way?
You all see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Okay, so welcome. Thank you everyone for participating in the Dix Edge area study, phase later workshop. Today, we'll be talking about future land use and housing for all. So just first a couple of housekeeping items. Throughout the meeting, we'd like for you to participate, share your thoughts, and ask questions. However, we're going to automatically mute everyone as to avoid any distracting background noise. During the discussion sections, please use the raise hand feature and we'll unmute your microphone. You will be prompted with a pop-up box asking you to unmute yourself. Click unmute and then to be heard by the rest of the participants. If you have any questions during the middle of the presentation, please feel free to pop them into the chat box and we'll address it at the next breaking point. So today we'll have a brief presentation about the Dix Edge area study project before moving on. And then we'd like to hear from you. We have a series of questions that we'd like your feedback on and thoughts about during our group discussions. So today we'll be looking at the Dix Edge legacy and neighborhood story. We'll be talking about future land use and housing for all. So we'll look at a background and land use scenarios, and then kind of move into an affordable housing, feasibility factors, information, and some housing scenarios. So the Dix Edge Area Study will provide an opportunity to update and change the 2030 comprehensive plan specifically for the communities near Dix Park. The boundary of the Dix Edge Area Study was drawn to include Fuller Heights, Carolee, Carolina Pines, and other nearby communities because they represent some of the last remaining naturally occurring affordable housing in this part of the city. Considering property in these areas have historically been bought, sold, and rented for rates lower than much of the city by comparison, we believe that these are areas that have a high likelihood of increased development pressure, which may lead to the displacement of current residents. So the Dix Edge Area Study is approximately a 16-month process. Community members have already had the chance to participate in the process through a number of workshops since last fall. We are now in the action phase, and this is one of the phase later public workshops. Another round of engagement opportunities will be provided during the reflection phase for community members to provide their perspectives, concerns, and ideas. As part of the phase later, in addition to tonight's meeting, we'll be hosting a community cookout on August 28th from noon until 3 p.m. at Eliza Pool Park. So we hope to see you there. Another virtual workshop on August 31st at 6:30 p.m. to discuss the preferred options for the Lake Wheeler Road and South Saunders Street streetscapes and other transportation options. And also a survey to collect feedback on the preferred options will launch tomorrow at raleighnc.gov/dix/edge. And so now I'd like to turn it over to LaToya to discuss the legacy and story of the Dix Edge area neighborhoods.
Thanks, Deirdre. So I've had the privilege of working with the city on understanding the history of this rich study area, understanding the different people who have made up the communities, understanding the unique aspects of the different neighborhoods, all of the various amenities that currently exist, as well as a lot of things throughout history that have been gained and lost as various changes have occurred over the past several decades. And so I've worked on helping to create and compile this larger neighborhood story that will be rolled out as part of this process. So we're calling it the Dix Edge, a neighborhood story to inspire collective action. And the goal of this story is to both capture and uplift the community's history for future generations, but also to think about how can we create opportunities for action throughout this planning process. Next slide. And so in order to talk about the neighborhood story and the history, and also understand how the history can inform future decision-making, particularly around land use and development, it's really important as part of this process that we acknowledge the history in the city of Raleigh of inequity, particularly as it relates to housing, as it relates to land use, and as it relates to the historic treatment of Black and Brown communities in particular. And so a big part of this neighborhood story is really uplifting a lot of that legacy and understanding how decisions that were made in the past have really informed what the city of Raleigh looks like now, but then also provides a guide for how we can make different decisions going forward into the future as part of this process. And as noted here, we really do see this story and this process as a way to build a bridge to the future, particularly as we think about how the landscape of the city can change over time. It's also important to think about how future decisions in this process guide decision-making around equity. How do we ensure that land use, that housing, that access to transportation, access to jobs, how do we ensure that there's equal opportunity and equal access to everyone in the city, both folks who are here now, as well as folks who might come in the future? We really believe this process and this story can be a way to inspire collective action and collective prosperity. Next slide. So the neighborhood story is going to be coming out very soon. It'll be a digitally based tool using what's called S3 Story Map. And it's going to include a mix of information. It'll provide historical overview and background, probably information that many of you know about the city's history, as well as some other facts that you might not be as aware of. We'll also provide some present day context, but then also providing a call to action as part of this process. This story map is going to really serve two purposes. The first is to provide a clear documentation of the history, particularly as it pertains to land use decisions and inequity over time in the city, but then also to uplift the other narratives and the other stories, as well as people's ideas for the future. So you'll have an opportunity through the story map to add your history. It could be your family's history, it could be other histories that you know of that have been passed down through generations. And you'll also have a chance to continue to add your feedback to this process. So we hope this neighborhood story can be considered an additional tool to allow you to engage with the city and engage in this process in a really dynamic and innovative way.
So the next part of the presentation, we're going to focus on the future land use and housing for all, which includes affordable housing. And in the first section, in the land use, we're going to share with you the preferred land use option that we have been developing based on the feedback that we have received from the community in the last phase, which was the phase soon. So if we go to the next slide, wanted to give you a little bit of context before we jump into the preferred land use options. As you might know, every piece of property in Raleigh has a future land use designation, is one of the many tools that the city has to manage growth and development. So if you look at the map on the left-hand side, it shows the different kind of uses, including residential, which might be different shades of yellow and the orange. The higher intensity and the higher growth areas are along the corridors, which are the darker brown, the reds, and the pinks. And then you have the parklands and the public and private open spaces, which are denoted in green. So this future land use map tool is used by the city planners to evaluate applications and requests to change or rezone properties or a collection of properties. And that's one of the ways to manage growth and development. Next, we are going to focus into the LIHTC neighborhood. The study area is roughly bounded by Lake Wheeler Road on the west and the Dix Park and Wilmington Street on the east. On the northern side, it is bounded by Western Boulevard and Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. And on the south side, just south of the Interstate 40, we have the Carolina Pines Road, the Carolina Pines neighborhood, and the Pecan Road. So as far as the land uses are concerned, there are pockets of residential, all of the yellows that you see, Carolina, Fuller Heights, the Carolina Pines neighborhood on the south side of I-40. Then one of the biggest areas or the biggest swaths of land uses are this darker brown color, which is the regional mixed use, which allows for higher intensities of development within the study area. So keep that in mind and context as we go through the preferred land use options. And on the south side of I-40, we have a combination of higher intensity residential, business and commercial services, and then along the Rocky Branch and the Walnut Creek corridors, all of the greens that you see are the private and public parks and open spaces. And the next, before we share with you the preferred land use scenario, I wanted to just quickly touch upon the three options that we shared with you during the phase soon process. And those are the three options that you see in the screen right now. And the three maps are showing different gradations of intensities and scale. So the lightest color of the pink are showing the 1 to 3 story, mainly residential development. The medium pink color are showing more of a transitional intensity, medium scale, which are 3 to 5 stories. And the highest intensities are the darker purple areas, which are the kind of 10 to 12 stories. And we are also showing the orange coloration of the existing planned developments, which includes downtown South, just to the north of Interstate 40 and east of South Saunders, as well as the Park City South on the northern side of the study area, just south of Western Boulevard. So the first option was densification along major roads, which you can see along South Saunders, Maywood, Wilmington, and just south side of I-40, you have the dark coloration, which can allow for highest intensities. The medium intensities are along Lake Wheeler and just south of I-40, and the lowest intensities are the residential pockets of Raleigh, Fuller Heights, and Carolina Pines. Option 2 was mixed use around intersections. You can see the circles and the ellipses and the bubbles around the major intersections, such as the South Saunders and Mead Avenue, Mead and Lake Wheeler, as well as within the quarter-mile radius of the future potential BRT stops. And the future BRT is planned to be along Western Boulevard, Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, as well as Wilmington Street. Rest of the corridor areas are the medium scale, medium intensity developments, and the lighter ones are the residential neighborhoods. And option 3 was the modest scale neighborhoods, where it is 3 to 5 stories of neighborhoods all throughout the corridor without any kind of fluctuations of those kind of densities. As far as the feedback that we received during the phase soon workshops and the survey during that phase, option 2 was the most preferred option that came out, followed by option 1, densification along major roads, and the modest scale neighborhoods, the option 3 was the least favored. So with that all of said, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, who is going to use this feedback to share with you the preferred land use option.
Thank you. Next. All right, this is the preferred land use option we came up with based on that. It is one thing, it's a little different than the future land use map. We're talking about some very careful form controls on buildings. It's sort of a mix of intensity and character. In this plan, trying to have a balance of preservation along with sustainable and affordable growth, responding to the big pressures on this area. It has the growth clustered around the centers, and those centers are influenced by the BRT stations. If you notice the thin black circles, the smaller one is a quarter mile. Those are within planned BRT stations, so those get an extra dose dose of intensity. And also in all this, an idea that affordable housing is not concentrated in one spot or one type of area, but is throughout. Next slide. We're going to look at the urban centers. These are the most intense areas. Now you may notice that along Lake Wheeler Road, that's more like a string than a center, but that's of an appropriate intensity. That's balancing the real draw and the importance of Dix Park as a desirable frontage and something that we can take advantage of. But the other centers are relative to available land near BRT centers. And then you notice right in the middle around Saunders and Maywood, establishing a center right in the middle of our study area. And as I think Security mentioned before, these are the most intense. Uses are flexible. Height, maximum 10 to 12 stories with a potential with negotiated public benefits. The height could go up to as high as 20. So those potential public benefits, of course, include affordable housing. And there's some control on the scale of the buildings, but these are bigger buildings. And then affordable housing definitely within these tall buildings. Next slide. And a thought, these may be buildings like this. These are not the fullest height, but environments like this, mixed use, definitely urban concentrations of people, offices or residences above. Next slide. This is a little bit bigger scale look. Next slide. And one quick thing to point out, I'd say more important than what the individual buildings look like is look at the total area and imagine yourself walking down the sidewalk on these. That environment that gets created is critical to how good a place it is for for people. All right, next slide. And some of these buildings are going to be purely residential. So you may have buildings like this. Next slide. And I'm going to bring you back to that sidewalk level. This we should be making great environments like this. This is an environment with storefronts and retail, but it looks like a great place for human beings to be. Next slide. And another example, fairly high intensity, purely residential building here, but a good human environment. And what happens right at the street is very important. And for the urban centers, this isn't a typical residential street. This is a center, but these places should provide small pocket parks, which even though they're very small and they look small on a map, like this one, you see there are places that get used very intensely and are part of the value and part of the balance of getting that higher intensity development. Next slide. And now we're going to talk about the urban corridors. Really, these are places that are at a mid-level of intensity. Next. Here you see them. They are somewhat along corridors. Some of those corridors have widened up, but medium intensity, flexible uses again, talking about here a maximum height of 5 stories, which could be negotiated up to 12 stories with public benefits. The lot width or individual building width is held down to 160 feet. That keeps the scale of the development there on a little smaller increment. And again, the use is very flexible along corridors. On the ground floor, you could have retail, but the rest a mix of residential and office. And again, affordable housing within these buildings. One of the more important parts of those public benefits would be affordable housing. Next slide. And are you all hearing me? My screen is telling me there's, okay, little microphone issue thing popped up. And here's an idea. Actually, this is all photoshopped, not a real picture, but of what one of those urban corridors could be like with a BRT station and here located right in the middle, although that's not one of our recommendations, but that's one of the options. So environments like this, fairly intense on fairly well-traveled streets. Next slide. And could be buildings like this. Next slide. Mixed use. Next slide. Here, building perhaps an office or residential on the right. Residential apartment buildings. Next slide. Again, all right. Next slide. I think we go to the neighborhoods now. And if you live in this area, this is where most probably talking about you and where you live. Next slide. Note there are 2 gradations of residential. South of 40, there's a medium density, which allows bigger scale buildings, maximum building width on the street, 120 feet. Up on the north side of 40, a maximum 60 feet and maximum 3 stories. So this is about keeping the scale and the increment of development down to a smaller scale that will be more compatible with the existing neighborhoods. And we think fit better and also perhaps open up the opportunities for smaller scale developers and developments. And here, affordable housing again, some set aside units, perhaps more with accessory dwelling units, things like garage apartments, et cetera. All right, next slide. And potentially in buildings like this. By the way, both the left and the right pictures are varieties of row houses. These are attached single family houses. The one on the left just takes extra effort to look more like a single family house. Next slide. Here, 2-story row houses. Next slide. Again, something with a, I don't know, some people would say more modern aesthetic, but really just row houses, single family attached. I would point out this particular set is longer than that 60-foot maximum we were talking about. So if you look at this to think about what might happen in your neighborhood, clip it off at the third big window. So about 3 units. I think these might be 20 feet wide. So 3 units would be the maximum you could have built together as one building. Next slide. I think we have some, yes, this is could be row houses, could be small apartment buildings. There's a lot of flexibility. Next slide. And these are actually row houses. Again, thinking in line with the gable roofs, making them look, keeping the scale more like single family houses. Next slide. And this is straight up a small apartment building. I'm sure this fits within that 60-foot width. A nice, simple building. Next slide. And this is a fairly similar small apartment building. However, this is bigger than that 60-foot limit. This is more like 80 feet. So this would not be, this is too big to be in that lower scale neighborhood north of 40, but it would fit down south. Next slide. And also there's certainly room for single family detached. These are a set of relatively, I guess now they're about 40 years old, relatively new single family houses. These are really small 2-story front porch houses. I think they're 24 feet wide on 30-foot lots or something like that. But you know, they can be attached or detached, but it's allowing the intensity on a lot that might have one house now, it might have 2 houses under this scheme. And let's talk about the idea of, we're calling it perhaps light industrial or mixed use / maker space. Next slide. And this is a straightforward way about jobs. An idea that lining up against the freeway south of I-40, there are these pockets of land where we would allow almost everything but residential. There's you could have some very tiny residential in these, like less than 200 square feet by an owner. But these are really places where people would make things, small manufacturing that they might have some sales of things they produce on site, but it's like incubator businesses, et cetera. And I said before, this is really about jobs and helping jobs and businesses get started. Next slide. And some images of what these might look like. Actually, I know this example is actually in Overland Park, Kansas. It's a little business that started in somebody's garage. Now they employ about, well, I haven't checked in 5 years or so, but close to 100 people. It's a t-shirt company that's expanding beyond that. Just 1 block off their main street. Next slide. And these are not fancy buildings. They don't need to be fancy buildings, but they need to have a good street space in front of them. Here's an idea about something more intense. That could be light industrial behind that facade. Next slide. And again, they can be sort of fancy architect buildings, but they don't have to. Next slide. Which I think most of you may know this. But simple buildings, they can be multi-story. But again, give them a decent street frontage with some sidewalk and some street trees. And it's a good place for small businesses and jobs to start. Next slide. And then to shift gears, a couple of things that go along with this that we're recommending. The first is a set of rules that we call neighborhood manners. We have some existing neighbors here, and neighborhood manners are about being sure that new buildings that are built adjacent to the existing houses that are typically much bigger, there's a set of rules that keep them as good neighbors and don't allow them to dominate over those existing structures. And the things like simple setbacks and setback planes so that the new buildings don't crowd out and sort of aesthetically, or if you live in one of those houses, kind of damage your day-to-day living experience. The second big idea I think we mentioned before is the idea that affordable housing, and some call it workforce housing, but it really goes through a range of different levels of affordability, is distributed throughout the project. It's in the new really tall center buildings, the middle buildings, and the new buildings in the neighborhood. And third is parking, which to make this work really needs to be, there's a lot of shared parking district-wide, and it's easy to find. And I think the last bullet here is maybe, I think the most radical thing that we've talked about, and that's the idea is to consider that if you do build new parking structures, build them in such a way that they can later be converted into habitable space, buildings for people, which means they're taller floor to floor, so that in the future that a lot of us think is going to come and we don't need so much parking space, those buildings can be converted, take the ramps out and turn them into places where people live and work. All right, thank you.
And Sarah, do you want to launch the polls?
Sure thing. So I'm going to start with poll number 1. All right. So we now have poll open. Can everyone see that on the screen? It should say red areas primarily with a mix of use, and then we have.
Yeah, I can see it.
So we couldn't hear any of that.
Oh, I'm sorry, Becky. I just wanted to confirm that everyone could see the poll on their screen right now, and I can narrate I'll read the question out loud too. So what we're asking is, we're showing this map right now that has some red areas called the urban centers. That's what Security and Jeff talked a little bit about. And so the question says, red areas primarily with a mix of uses. These areas cluster around major roadway intersections or within half a mile of future bus rapid transit or BRT stations with 10 to 12 stories in height. How consistent is this type of development you are comfortable with? And I accidentally put an extra question mark there. So a lot of emphasis. And there are I know y'all know this, no wrong answers. We are not collecting data on who is saying what. It's just what your honest opinion is. Maybe we'll just give it another minute or two. I see maybe we have about half the folks voted. I know this is a lot of text to sort of absorb. And if folks have any clarifying questions or you're not quite sure what the poll is asking, please feel free to raise your hand or unmute and ask, and we're happy to provide any more explanation. And we're also going to have some discussion about this too, so don't worry. Okay, it looks like most of the folks here voted. I'm just going to give it maybe a couple more seconds if anyone's still thinking about it, and then I will end the poll and show y'all what folks were thinking. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end polling. Okay, so here are the results that we got. So it looks like there is a bit of a split between consistent and somewhat consistent, and between very consistent and not at all consistent. So thanks for participating. Stop sharing those results. All right. And then we are going to ask you a similar question, and I'll go ahead and read this out and also just take your time. So Security and Jeff talked to you about the orange areas on the map, the urban corridor, and this poll question is the same as the previous. Says these areas can contain a mix of uses, in some instances 5 stories in height. How comfortable, and I do want to be very clear and say up to 12 if public benefits are negotiated. So would not exceed 5, but could go up to 12 with public benefit.
how consistent is the type of development that you're comfortable with? And again, no wrong answers. We are not recording who answers what. Just want to gauge how folks are feeling. I'll just give this a little bit more time and wait for a few more folks to vote. Looks like most of our folks have voted, but we're just going to give it maybe 20 more seconds or so if anybody's still thinking about it.
Very similar results.
Sorry, you're seeing results from a previous poll?
Yeah, I'm just talking about from the red areas to orange areas, very similar responses.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said I still had the wrong results. Oh, no. Okay, that's perfect time to end the polling. And let me show you what here we're at. Okay. So it looks like folks, generally, the majority of folks thought somewhat consistent. And then we have sort of followed by consistent, not at all consistent, very consistent. So thanks for sharing with us. And then we're going to do one more poll on the land use topic. All right, I'll launch this. So similar to before, but this time we're asking you about the neighborhoods. So again, this is asking about Fuller Heights, Carolee, Walnut Terrace, Carolina Pines, the yellow areas on the map, that these are existing single family neighborhoods and new housing development areas. How comfortable are you with this type of development? I'll just give this maybe another minute or so for folks to vote, and then I'll share the results with you. All right, we'll close it in just 1 second. If anybody else wants to vote, we'd be happy. We'd love to hear from all of you. All right, I'm going to hit end polling and I will share the results so we can see what folks were saying. So it looks like this, folks were more comfortable with this, that generally people were thinking this was consistent. But then it looks like the next one following was somewhat consistent, and then the least result was not at all consistent. So thanks all, I appreciate that. And I'm going to stop sharing the poll results.
Russ?
Folks, yes, thank you, Security. A lot of our past meetings, we've talked about affordable housing in sort of general terms. We wanted to get a little bit more specific. Next. And what I'm going to do is sort of take you through a series of slides that sort of help us sort of conceptualize what we're talking about, who benefits from affordable housing, what are the price points of housing, what are the incomes that we would anticipate. As we've discussed in the past, affordable housing is when people's mortgage payments or rents with utilities do not exceed 30% of their household's monthly income or annual income. People paying more than 30% are generally considered cost burden, meaning they're paying more than they should. That's the reality of a lot of people in the country, that they do pay more than 30%, but 30 is this sort of the ideal level. I'm going to show you the results of analysis we did. It was using federal data, which gives us information about people's incomes as well as the cost of housing. Now, because it's 2019 data, we can't keep up with the current state of the housing market. It's moving too quickly. But for that point in time, we're looking at a relationship between people's incomes and the cost of housing and rents in our study here. So why don't we continue? Here's, back in 2012, we were coming out of the Great Recession, and you see the divergence of rental costs and home sale prices. They're escalating at a faster pace than incomes were. Now they're sort of running parallel, but there's a big gap in between, and that's sort of contributing to the difficulty people have in, in, in affording housing locally. Next. These are sales that occurred in our study area, Dix Edge, 34 home sales in the last 2020 to 2021. The blue part of the bars for each one of those sales is the assessed value, meaning that's what people are taxed on. These are ownership housing. The orange part of the bars are what people paid for those homes above what the assessed value was. So although assessed values are never exactly equal to what the sales price is, this gives you a sense of how much people paid above what the city said those homes were worth. So this is a contributing factor. It's just sort of a rapidly appreciating housing market, and prices are rising above what they were. Next. This is a study area, and the analysis looks at two different census tracts. This is a census tract sort of generated analysis. So, it's not a perfect match, obviously, as you can see, but it should be a decent indicator of what that supply of housing is versus what people can afford. And that's really what I want to emphasize. Next. Before we get into that, I have two polls that Sarah's going to help me with. And it sort of gets at some of these issues that we've discussed in the past. Can we pull up the next slide? Poll's in the way, so I would move it out of the way if you can't see the presentation. Now, we've talked about density in the past, and here is several different types of housing with the most dense housing at the end, which is basically a 24-unit apartment building. And the question asks how different types of housing benefit more people per lot. And the question is, how many people do you suppose can be accommodated in the 5-story apartment building? It's from the poll options, and then we'll reveal it in the next slide.
Sorry, I was over here clicking too many times on the polls, and I apologize for making that reappear on your screen. Okay, I'm gonna relaunch. Sorry, that was okay. Hopefully everyone is seeing a question saying, how many people do you think could be housed by 5-story apartments? Sorry about that, y'all. That's my bad.
So you should lodge your guess. Obviously, a single family home, it could be one family. That's typically what the situation is, but we're asking you about the apartment building.
We may go a little faster through these polls just to respect folks' time, so I'll just give it a couple more seconds. And again, no wrong answers. We cannot see who answers what. All right, so give this maybe another couple seconds. I'm going to hit end poll and share the results.
Now, the point to emphasize here is you'll notice that the lot sizes are identical for each one of these buildings. It's just a different building on the land. Why don't we reveal? Next slide. 12 to 40 people, depends on how many people are occupying each apartment. That's generally what you might expect in terms of the number of people. So in one case, we have a single family home, which accommodates one family, maybe 3 or 4 people. And at the end, we're greater number of people. Now there are different living space, obviously. We go to the next question. Next slide. Okay, now we're talking about a townhouse or a row house. We have 3 of them here. What would be your guess on this one? So we'll pull up the poll.
Are folks, I think folks are seeing the poll. Yeah, I see folks
Yes.
are voting.
Yeah, polls up.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing it, so you know when.
Oh, I think it's because you're a co-host, Russ. Only the participants will see the poll. I'll give folks just another couple seconds. Seen any more votes come in, so I'm going to hit end polling and share the results.
People are guessing 3 to 12 is the most likely. Deirdre, can you click? There you go. Correct. Thank you for answering that. Now, this is sort of looking at this as a single building. Of course, it could be 3 separate ownership buildings. Walls is attached.
Russ, would you mind coming closer to the microphone? I think it is cutting off and on.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Next, please. This is just to show you the relationship between the size of the lot and how much land is allocated.
For
Oh, sorry. I think Mel unmuted. Go ahead, Russ.
I'm sorry. This is just to sort of show you the relationship between the size of a lot. In this case, it's 5,000 square feet. Just so you know, an acre is 43,560 square feet. So you can have a relative sort of relationship there. And as you increase the number of units on the lot, you increase or you decrease the number of land, the amount of land that's dedicated to each occupant or each housing unit. Now, I will qualify this and say that once you sort of get to the point where you're putting in a 24-unit apartment building, the city's assessor is now reevaluating the value of that land, and it does go up, but on a per unit basis, it's much cheaper than a single family home. And that's where the relationship starts to show that each person now starts to use less land, and it's valued at less per unit than the single family home. But it doesn't in and of itself make it affordable. Next. Now, the question has come up in the past, who are we planning for? Who is the intended beneficiary of affordable housing? And this seemed like the simplest way to sort of make that point. These AMI levels that we've talked about in the past, now we've attached an annual salary to. Now, in fairness, when you determine affordable housing, it's based on the household income, not just the household income. So this is sort of expressed in a way that sort of suggests that a secretary making $38,000 a year fits within 50 to 80%. She may very well if she's a one-person household, but in many cases there's multiple earners in the household. That would be judged against the AMI level. So just take a second to sort of look at who those folks are. They're our neighbors, they're our friends, they're people that we know who need housing at different levels. What you see on the bottom is the type of housing in Raleigh that's available at those various price points. Now you'll note that there are no homes priced under 118,000. I looked, I suppose if I went further away from the center city, I might eventually run into a home out in the deep country, but that's not what I was looking for. I was looking for something reasonably close to our study area. So I also don't want to suggest that there's lots of homes in these price range. So that's the essence of the challenge here. We're trying to create more housing that's priced at people's incomes if they want to buy a home. Now, what I wanted to do, yes, go back to the slide left. That's the ownership housing.
Can we go back one slide? Oh, I go forward.
Another one. This is a comparison. The analysis that we did looked at the number of people at these different AMI levels, which I just shared with you, versus how many housing units are available based on the federal data at those different price points. Now, not to sort of get any deeper into it than that, the blue bars show the number of units that are available to people at these different income levels. And you see that on the ownership side, there's just not that many ownership units left. We estimate 178. And what happens is that we have, for the people who are making less than 30% AMI, there's sufficient number in 2019 to accommodate that. There's a surplus as we go up to 80% AMI. So what happens, unfortunately, though, is the people who make more income, and on the bottom, over 120% AMI, they don't have homes priced at their level that they could afford. So what do? Either they move out of the area or they purchase properties that are really below what they could afford. So they compete with others that have less income. And it becomes this competitive situation where folks with more money have to buy homes that are priced less, and that crowds out people who don't have that ability to pay more. And that's the essence of the sort of the ownership side of this, is that we've created a competitive situation for people that allow people with greater incomes to sort of buy up what units are available. Let's move on to the rental side.
Oh, could we, I'm sorry, Jen asked a question. I just wanted to make sure it got answered because I think other people probably have the same question. She said, is this chart showing the tightest supply is homes for 80 to 100 or 120% AMI households?
That is the tightest in that particular AMI range. You see at the 51 to 80% AMI, there's surplus units for the number of households that claim to be in that range. But it's sort of a phantom surplus, because if others above them are going to buy those homes, then there really isn't a surplus. It just looks like when you compare the incomes to the available supply, it looks like there's a surplus. But if others are competing for it, then it goes away very quickly. It becomes this very competitive market situation. Rental. We have to go back one. All right, here's the rental breakdown. Now in Dix Edge, the size of the rental households is actually larger than the size of the ownership households. These are 3-person households. And you see what the Dix Edge median household income is, $39,863. We've used that number before. And that essentially puts the average household in the 30 to 50 category, which you see the range there in the various occupational folks. Now, obviously, when we're talking rental, that brings in a lot of different types of housing, from apartment buildings to duplexes, and a lot of people rent single-family homes where they can find them. But I've tried to give you some sense of what a 2-bedroom unit would go for in these various developments. And at the low end, you'd be hard pressed to find anything in our study area at those price points. The complexes are there, but so these other ones start to spread out and get out of our area. Next. Now, in this case, I think this might be what most people would expect, is that people at 30% AMI and below don't have enough apartment or rental units to accommodate their needs, to meet their needs. And that starts to change as the incomes go up. But, someone who's a bartender or a order taker is going to struggle to find anything that's available within their price range. And I think that sort of speaks to, as we start to think about how we meet these needs going forward, we have a better sense of who we're trying to plan for and what it's going to take to bring on affordable housing at those price points. As we get further up the income scale, for example, at the highest range, there really aren't any units that are priced for those folks. They probably have to leave the neighborhood as well to find something that is more in keeping with what they're looking for, unless those are created in the future. But clearly here, the emphasis on sort of 3% and below.
I want to cut in real quick because there was a question in the chat from John on the slide showing the typical earnings. Does it assume 1 person per housing unit?
It's assuming, as I was alluding to, it's 1 person per household. Now, as I mentioned, that they don't judge the affordability on the income of just one person. It's everyone in the household that's contributing to the household income. So if you have a spouse, you would add their income to it. So it was simplified just for presentation purposes to show one type of person by occupation, so you can see the equivalent income those folks make versus where they fit on that scale. Now, what are we talking about when we're talking about affordable housing? And, you know, typically if you're talking about a market rate development where there is no affordability, you know, those revenues that are derived from the project basically cover the costs, including profit to whoever's doing it. Now, when you don't have basically people paying full rents for units, there's a gap that's created, and then you need to find some way to fill that gap. And that's where the affordable housing strategy comes into play. Where do you get that money? What fills the gap? What we wanted to do is sort of look at sort of maybe the type of development we may see in Dick's Edge, a 5-story apartment building. Jeff showed you other versions of that. And we sort of played this out as though we were building such a building. And we looked at the indicators in the market to determine what type of units we would have, how much that would cost. And this is a 240 unit on 5 floors. Next. What we learned is something I want to share with you now. We were trying to figure out if it was a market rate building, meaning there was not an affordable building, what would it look like? And then we compare that against 2 other affordable scenarios. So we're going to sort of ask you a couple of questions, and we've talked about these issues in the past. In a market rate development, what % of the total units are affordable? Keep that in mind. Sorry, where are you letting it continue?
Oh, and sorry, Russ, I know you can't see the polls. I'm sharing the results right now, and Russ will share the answer, and then I'll keep the polls moving when you're ready, Russ.
Okay. The correct answer is 0, because this is a situation where we're not, there's not any subsidy, there's not any attempt to create affordable housing. And the next question is, in a market rate development, how much public investment is required to make the project feasible? This is kind of a trick question of sorts.
And Russ, the poll is open, so you know, right?
I'm able to see this one.
Okay, perfect.
All right, why don't we go to our reveal on both of these, Peter? Now, not surprisingly, if we don't have any affordable units, we're not expecting to subsidize the developer here. They are charging people the normal rents that are available in the marketplace, and there's no subsidy that is brought to the table to help that developer. Doesn't really need any assistance to make that project work, because there's no affordable housing. Next.
Hey Russ, just in the interest of time, we might skip doing the polls, but we can go through the information if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's fine. Let me go to the next one then. So this next scenario is an affordable housing project where 60% are market rate. That's sort of the going rates. And 40% is at 60% AMI. And we've talked about these levels before, and you saw what they equate to. And what we're asking is, what percent of the 100% AMI, which is 83,500, would be a 3-person household at 60%. Sounds a little confusing, but basically what you do is you take the 100% AMI times 60%, gives you what that person would have to make to make that unit affordable. It's 50,100. The next is the amount of subsidy required, and we created a model that helped us determine this. But when you start to subsidize units at that level, there's actually a contribution that needs to be made by some other source other than the developer. And in this case, if you go to the next slide, that number is 21,613. That's what each affordable unit in that development would need to make it affordable for at least 15 years. So that's when you're talking about a low-income housing tax credit project, that's usually the period of affordability, at which point the project can convert at the end of 15 years back to a market rate project. So that's roughly the level of subsidy that the city of Raleigh is putting into a number of the affordable housing projects that are involved in. Next, final question. This is a more extreme scenario where it's 100% affordable, but at the different levels of incomes. One will be at 60%, one will be at 30%. And the question I was posing in this scenario was, how much would we have to subsidize or provide outside money to make those units affordable? And realizing that every single unit isn't paying the full market rate. In this case, it's 104,748. So we'd have to come up with that amount for each of the affordable units in the building to make that successful. In essence, you basically have to bring almost, 70% of the total cost of the building to the table from outside sources. And that just probably wouldn't happen in the real world. And I think that's the point. There needs to be some balancing between the level of affordable units and the amount of money that's available to make them affordable. And I think some people in the past have said, why can't all of these be benefiting people at 30% AMI? I think the short answer is there's not enough money. Typically, that would be a public housing project. And that's the purview of the Raleigh Housing Authority, which they maintain a supply of housing. But separate that supply from what we're calling affordable housing, which is done with different mechanisms, different funding. And we move on to the next slide. Here's where we are standing right now in terms of some of the policies that we hope to have included in the final plan. There'll be an action strategy for each one of these policies so we can move towards these, the achievement of these policies. We'll have much more information about that in our next presentation. But I want you to start thinking about these, and we'll be into this list as well. And in essence is my presentation.